Peter to pen. There was some events in the church, some things that needed to be settled with regard to Judaism. God had a purpose for Peter. And He'd already told Peter the way he was going to die. And He'd already told him, hey, you're going to be put to death. Peter didn't have a problem with that. It wasn't conditional in the life of Peter. God, if you spare my life, I'll serve you. But if I die, I'm going to renounce you. No, Peter understood. Hey, when he was restored to Jesus, it was unconditional. I'll just follow you, Lord. Whatever you want from me is what I want in my life. And the church prayed without ceasing. And it brought God glory to deliver Peter. I want to just make it that simple tonight. Let's don't read into things any more than what the Scripture teaches. It brought God glory. What brings God glory? You ought to ask yourself that question. You ought to understand it so you know how to pray. You know what brings God glory? Doing things that are far beyond man's ability. Doing things that are far beyond man's ability. And it brought God glory to let Peter out of jail. And so here we find that when he considered the thing, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark. So it's John Mark, where many were gathered together praying. Verse 13, and as Peter touched the door of the gate, a damsel came to hearken named Rhoda. And so here's Rhoda's moment to shine. When she knew Peter's voice, she opened not the gate for gladness. Now, the Scripture is not saying that Rhoda was unhappy that Peter knocked at the gate. She was just so happy she was beside herself. And so she's, Peter! She took off running to tell everybody about it. And here's Peter left outside. Some of you ladies might understand this. I don't know. I was in Kansas a few weeks ago with my parents, and there was one of those funny video shows that they have. And this lady, there was a surprise party. Melissa, were you there? Did you see that? This lady was just like, ah! And she couldn't talk. All the people, and she's going, ah! 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 And a bunch of people had surprised her for a party. It was really funny if you'd have seen it. My imitation's probably better. But anyway, as she saw each person that had surprised her, she couldn't say anything. And so that's sort of what happened to Rhoda here. Rhoda hears the knocking. They say, Rhoda, go get the gate. And Rhoda goes out, and there she is. And so then they went and told, there's a song about Rhoda, isn't there? Go tell Aunt Rhoda the old gray goose is dead. Boy, that's not funny, is it? What's that have to do with anything? Anyway, so then I knew Rhoda was famous for something else. Well, so then Rhoda runs inside, and she tells them, and they don't believe her. Christian, answer to prayer is not conditional. God's answering prayer is based upon His ability. Now, we understand when we study Scripture that there are hindrances to prayer. Do you understand that? The Bible says certain things in the Bible, that your prayers be not hindered. Fellowship with the brethren. Not being in fellowship with brethren will hinder your prayers. Not being in fellowship with the Lord will hinder your prayers. Sin will keep you from fellowship with the brethren and with the Lord, and so your prayers will be hindered. I don't think there's sin in the church. There's not something wrong happening here that Peter's been taken, so they're praying without ceasing. I mean, they're just praying and praying and praying. God, I don't know what you're going to do. I don't know how you can do it, but Lord, would you spare the life of Peter? And now Peter's outside, and Rhoda comes in and tells them Peter's outside, and they said, we don't believe it. Now, they had two good reasons for not believing. Number one, because he was left outside, and so they didn't see him with their own eyes. But secondly, what she told them was impossible. And friend, if you can just get it in your mind that it pleases God to do the impossible, you'll come to a place when you'll know how to pray. When you come to the understanding that it pleases God to do the impossible, you'll come to a place when you'll know how to pray. Hey, what in the world are you asking God to do things that you could do? And by the way, don't misunderstand me. The Bible teaches us when Jesus taught His disciples how to pray, He said, pray, give us this day our daily bread. Well, you know how to work, don't you? But don't you understand that everything that you have comes from the Lord? And you ought to pray for provision. You ought to pray for the simple things. You really ought to. But when you ask God for something, how often do you ask for something that man can't do? How often do you pray for the impossible? And that's what the believers have prayed for, and they've had an answer to prayer, and they don't believe it. God give us some unbelievable answers to prayer. God give us some unbelievable answers to prayer. He hasn't changed. He hasn't changed. But I think we see very little of it because we don't know how to pray. And we misunderstand what God's power is. Because too often we think we know what God should do. And I would submit to you from this passage of Scripture, if we had picked what God should have done, James would have never died. If we made the decision on how God should have done things, James would not have been put to death. Christian, we need to stop telling God how to do it and start praying for Him to do what He wants to do. How about instead of telling God what He's allowed to do with your life, giving Him your life? Saying, God, I'd like to have the power of your Spirit. I'd like to be empowered for service. Lord, I don't know what you'll do with me, but I just want you to use me any way you'd like to. He might use you to go in the synagogue and preach the gospel, and folks will come to the Lord, and it'll bother people so much they'll throw rocks at you and put you to death. It might bring glory to Him. And the consequence might be that someone like Saul will get saved. And I'm just telling you, you just don't know what God can do because it's way beyond our scope of imagination. And we need to just start praying for the impossible and start to surrender ourselves in a way that God could do whatever He wants to. But I fear that if God had His way, it would contradict our way too often. And that's the reason we don't see mighty answer to prayer. And we don't see great power in our lives and the lives of the church. Now, Peter continued knocking, verse 16. They told her, "Thou art mad." They said, "You're crazy, Rhoda." She constantly affirmed that it is even so. Then they said, "It is his angel." Don't go and make some strange Bible doctrine. In Judaism at this time, there was a lot of worship of angels. They didn't worship the Lord, the church. And the church had a lot of false doctrine. But if you study the church, they were really into angels, big time into angels, and had names for all kind of angels. And a lot of that got corrected out of the church because they were worshiping spirits instead of God. And so, are there angels? Yes. Did Peter have an angel that was a ghost that looked like him, was walking and wandering about? That's what they thought. But I just want to remind you that wasn't so. It was Peter. And so just because they were incorrect about something, don't go and make some strange doctrine. I've heard people take this passage of Scripture and say, see, every person has a ghost that looks like them, is not there, whatever they want to come up with. Friend, it wasn't. These people were wrong about what they thought it was. They were incorrect. It was Peter. Are we on the same page here? Okay, so it was Peter. It wasn't an angel. And they had a misconception. They should have spent more time praying, I guess. Peter continued knocking. When they'd opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. But he, beckoning unto them with the hand to hold their peace. Can you see this? Here they are, and they're astonished, and they probably started jabbering. And he said, "Quiet." Declared unto them how the Lord had brought him out of prison. He said, "Go show these things unto James and to the brethren." And he departed and went into another place. If he were a modern day preacher, what he would do would be to capitalize on this thing and get rich off of it. Isn't that true? He'd stage another miracle or two and he'd have it made, and he'd go around talking about it. And isn't it interesting, Peter's reaction to his deliverance? See, God didn't deliver Peter so that Peter could go around and say, "Here is the remarkable man that got out of prison, and nobody can explain it. Look what I did." Because Peter had nothing to do with his getting out of prison. Why did Peter get out of prison? Because God answered prayer. Peter was released from prison because God answered prayer. And he was not released from prison because he moved the heart of Herod. He was released from prison because God sent an angel to open the gate, to open the door, and walk him out. And it was a miracle. But isn't it interesting that this miracle in the Scripture is only mentioned? It's only mentioned. This is what happened. And I'm telling you, this is not that big a deal. It really isn't that big a deal. The church is all ready to make a big issue out of how Peter got out of prison. And Peter said, "Now just be quiet a second. God's done a mighty work." And so then he declared unto them how the Lord had brought him out of prison. He said, "Go show these things unto James and the brethren." So he said, "Go tell James and the brethren what happened." Now, why did he want him to tell James and the brethren? Come on, it's not that difficult.
So they could know about the answered prayer.
So they know God answered prayer. And so they wouldn't have to continue praying about it. They could pray for something else. And we're not to live our lives based upon what God has done. Yesterday's spiritual victory doesn't mean anything today. Yesterday's having seen the hand of the Lord move in a mighty way.